Good afternoon and welcome back to Trinity, where it's still nice and warm. We are going to bypass the introduction of the speaker and the namesake of the lecture series and the singing of the song because a lot of you were here this morning. Okay, so we're going to keep things simple and moving along, and Jesse is going to come forward to lead us in prayer, and then Ian will take the stage again. Jesse.
Good afternoon. This last lecture is in many ways the most difficult because the history is the freshest. So I'd like to share with you a prayer that has been attributed to Jakob Hutterites. What I love about this prayer is that he expresses his deep concern and love for both God and the church in this prayer. And I think that's something that we'll need as we go forward from this time, this place. Let's pray. O loving God, pour heavenly blessings upon the church, your garden. Water your garden with rain from heaven, the comfort of your Holy Spirit, and the oil of your compassion. Protect your garden with a fence to guard it from wild beasts. Protect it from thunderstorms and from evil blights, so that its fruit may ripen unto many good works. Keep watch until your garden comes to full bloom, and bring it to a bountiful harvest. Amen.
Welcome back again. Everybody was here this morning, and for all the new faces, thank you so much for coming. The title of the next lecture is called The Year of Jubilee. The 1974 uniting between the Schmiedelite and the Bruderhof communities was a pivotal moment for the Hutterites and the Bruderhof communities. In 1964, Bruderhof elder Heine Arnold and a couple of other Bruderhof servants of the word visited the Hutterite communities in Manitoba. At that time, Elder Peter Hofer's health was already failing, and Heine Arnold especially wanted to apologize to him personally for what happened in Forest River. After a short meeting with the three Bruderhof members, Elder Peter Hofer told Heine Arnold that he personally forgave him for anything he might have done. The next day, Elder Peter Hofer convened a small meeting in Milltown, where Heine Arnold again apologized to the 17 ministers who were in attendance. He was again assured that he was forgiven. The forgiveness that took place in 1964 did not, however, lead to a uniting between the Hutterites and the Bruderhof communities. As in 1955, there were strong differences in culture and spiritual practices that existed between the two groups. Bruderhof married men were not required to wear beards, and their women did not wear head coverings. The Bruderhof had completely abandoned the Hutterite dress code. As in 1955, the Bruderhof allowed the use of musical instruments, performed dramas, and celebrated certain events with folk dances. For many traditional-minded Hutterites, these were almost impossible hurdles to overcome. Despite these differences, there was a deep longing on both sides for reuniting. In 1973, Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser and Reverend Jacob Hofer paid the Bruderhof a surprise visit. They had been in Ottawa regarding church business. During their short stay, the two Hutterite ministers were deeply moved by their experience. They both felt strongly that a uniting should be possible. In June of that same year, 3 Darius-Lite ministers also visited the Bruderhof communities. Again, these Hutterite ministers felt a deep longing for reuniting with the Bruderhof. On the Bruderhof side, there were still strong concerns that a uniting with the Hutterites would force them to comply to the Hutterite traditions in ordningen. The question of addressing the Hutterite dress code particularly the head covering for women, was of particular concern. For his part, Heine Arnold shared these concerns, but he also longed for a deeper unity between the Hutterites. I, for my part, want to by no means to force anything, he said. But the brothers in the West simply won't understand it if we are not willing to yield to them on some points in love. Many Hutterites also feared a uniting with the Bruderhof, as they did not know what would be brought into their midst with the influx of such a large group of non-ethnic Hutterites. Would the Bruderhof be a worldly influence, which would lead many young Hutterites away from the church? Because of this fear, many spoke out against any form of uniting. However, other ministers like Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser from Crystal Spring, Reverend David and Reverend Michael Wallner from Milltown, pleaded with many who were opposed to reserve judgment until they have heard the brothers speak. Because of the ban placed upon the Bruderhof by the Hutterites, the groups could not worship together. In 1973, a small group of Hutterites, including Elder Joseph Kleinsasser from Sunnyside, visited the Bruderhof communities. Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser spoke out sharply against this prohibition to worship together, saying, "I don't understand one point. If there is ever a reason for coming to prayer, to lying prostrate before God, crying for help, and both sides have the same longing, why they should be hindered, a hindrance that we can do this." Heine Arnold then stood up and spoke in a loud voice, "This is the hour when we shall come to prayer." The moment when the two groups came together in prayer proved to be a significant moment in the history of both groups. When the 1974 Uniting meeting took place in Sturgeon Creek here in Manitoba, the concern of both sides seemed to melt away. Those who were present at that meeting spoke of how God's Spirit stepped in and overwhelmed all those present. As Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser put it, if Jesus comes into the center, everything will fall in place, and that is the only way to achieve unity. At the conclusion of the 74 meeting, the gathered ministers decided that all the baptized brothers and sisters who had left Forest River would need to be placed in exclusion for a time because of their behavior in Forest River and the fact that they had left the Hutterite church. 5 Hutterite ministers who would visit the Bruderhof communities to carry out the exclusion and the church forgiveness, and that this would then make them members of the Hutterite church once again. This last point came as a surprise to the Bruderhof. Heine Arnold wrote of this saying, "We had no opportunity to talk together alone, but we all felt that it was God's leading and that we had nothing to say. It would have been a second Forest River type sin if we had said we couldn't do that without asking at home first." Reverend Peter Cheddar, one of the Deersloyd representatives at the meeting, later wrote to his friend, Reverend Samuel Kleinsasser from Sturgeon Creek, saying, "Does this not represent for us the 100th year, the year of Jubilee, a forgiving year, a reconciliation year, when both the slave and the master have their hearts guided by God's goodness and have been united to a new year, a new life? For this I cannot raise my hands high enough. A figure of 1,000 people added to the church, a whole people. This was accomplished by God." It is important to acknowledge that the concerns from both sides were still lurking under the surface. At the time of the uniting, both groups were able to lay aside their differences in an attempt to bring about a unity of spirit. However, there were also some unintended consequences which already sowed seeds of disunity from the very beginning. For instance, when the Bruderhof and Hutterites parted way in 1955, the issues that separated them revolved around points of compliance with Hutterite customs and traditions and differences in practices. In 74, Heine Arnold and the Bruderhof representatives were told that the Hutterites would no longer require the Bruderhof to adopt the traditions and customs of the Hutterite church. It was decided that it was enough if they lived according to the leading of Christ's Spirit. However, when we look closely at the narrative, we can see that these concerns were still there. Heine Arnold said, "In Crystal Spring, we from the East talked together very briefly and felt convinced that it would have been a great sin if we had not accepted. We would once again sin against the Hutterite brothers and would again have to ask for forgiveness." He then recounts how someone asked about the points, or Ordnungen, and that Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser stated that the elder Joseph Kleinsasser and he had quite intentionally not brought up the points so as not to bring dissension. Heine Arnold clearly felt uneasy about the implications this would have for the future relationship. What complicated the matter even more was that the Bruderhof did not expect the Hutterites to take them back as members of the Hutterite Church. Heine and the other Bruderhof leaders who attended the Sturgeon Creek meeting were faced with the awkward position of having to return home and tell their people that they were now Hutterites again. The issue of the exclusion for all baptized members who left Forest River was a particularly thorny issue, as many of them seemed to feel, even years later, that the exclusion was wrong. According to one source, when Heine returned home, he ran into serious oppositions to the uniting, especially regarding the adoption of the Hutterite dress, in particular the head covering issue. In the end, Heine pushed for the total adoption of the Hutterite dress code, as he felt that without it, there would never be a real unity between the two groups. After Heine Arnold passed away in 1982, and intermarriage between the Hutterites and the Bruderhof took place, these tensions begin to grow as some Hutterite leaders begin to demand that the Bruderhof once again fully adopt the Hutterite orders and customs. The difference in childhood education, acceptance of musical instruments, social activism, and differing worship practices begin to drive a deeper wedge between some Hutterite communities and the Bruderhof. For many Bruderhof members, the Hutterite dress code became a form of social oppression. However, years of interaction and marriage also produced many positive results. Those Schmiedeloy communities who interacted most with the Bruderhof were often transformed by this relationship. Bruderhof members who moved to Hutterite communities for extended periods of time brought with them the love for music, a love for nature, and social activism. One of the things that was practiced, that I know that we practiced, was prison ministry. Probably one of the most profound and lasting impacts of the Bruderhof relationship was that it reawakened in many Hutterites a deeper appreciation for communal living. Many Hutterite young people who visited the Bruderhof communities were deeply moved by the elements of joy and simplicity of life that permeated Bruderhof society. They began to see their own tradition as a hindrance to authentic communal living. In contrast to the high standard of living found among the Hutterites, the Bruderhof communities lived a much simpler life, particularly in regards to housing. While our communities were becoming more autonomous or individualistic, the Bruderhof communities strived to maintain a deeper level of unity among their communities. The Hutterite church corporations. Starting around 1960, the Hutterite Church Corporation faced two major challenges. So this is the federally incorporated Hutterite body, which includes the Ders, and the Lehrleut, and the Schmiedeloit. The income tax and the Canada Pension Plan issues. Hutterites have always believed that it is their responsibility to pay taxes, with the one exception when taxes are specifically levied for war. Ever since settling in Canada, Hutterites have always paid their local or municipal taxes. However, when it came to paying income tax, which was a War Measures Act tax and a federal tax, the Hutterites had a problem, as the federal tax assumed that people had individual incomes. To the Hutterites, the idea of an individual income, like that of private property, was in fundamental conflict with their religion. And so some of the colonies were opposed to the income tax because it came out of World War I or World War II. It was a war tax. and others simply because, well, I guess I'll get into that later, because of how the government defined how they were going to make us pay taxes. So prior to 1960, the Hutterites did not have to worry about income tax because their communities were viewed as a church, and as such paid no income tax. So that's your perennial question. Do Hutterites pay tax? I'm sure a lot of you have been asked that question. This was in part because of the vow of perpetual poverty that every Hutterite makes when joining the church. In addition, because Hutterites did not have individual incomes, the government did not know how the income tax would be levied against them. Moreover, prior to 1960, the income of the average Hutterite community was so low that no significant amount of revenue would be gained, even if a satisfactory way could be found. This was a growing concern among Hutterite leaders and their legal counsel, and can be demonstrated in the fact that the colonies voluntarily, for a time, wouldn't collect a family allowance and old age pension, and they did that simply because their legal counsel advised them not to. He said, "Don't collect it because it'll might send a good message to the government that it's not all about money, right?" But in the end, it didn't really help. So this attempt by the Hutterites to avoid criticism from the general public did not work, as I mentioned. Public criticism of the Hutterites eventually prompted the federal government to announce late in 1960 that it would look into the matter further for the intent of taxing the Hutterites in a way that would produce a tax relatively equivalent to that paid by similar farming operations and be clearly supported by law. At this point, the government also indicated that as most of the Hutterite communities were incorporated, they might be subject to corporate tax. This was a huge concern for the Hutterites. A corporate tax would be extremely heavy and could bankrupt many of the Hutterite communities. Ever since the 1930s, most of the Hutterite communities had been incorporated. And as we saw in the last lecture, this came about largely because of Berwickman community, because of their financial difficulty. At that time, Berwickmen had argued that they are not only a church, they are also a farm. Therefore, they can claim protection against their creditors under what's called the Farmers' Aid Program. And the court agreed with them. And now the government turned around and said, by your own definition, you are also a corporation, therefore we will tax you as a corporation. Early in 1963, assessments were made of 2 incorporated Hutterite communities. Legal counsels for the Hutterites filed a formal objection and were able to delay the decision for a couple of years. But by 1965, the objections were overruled. At this point, the lawyers for the Hutterites met with the Minister of Revenue Department and requested a negotiated settlement, which would be on a basis other than corporate tax. At the same time, the Hutterites wanted to keep the issue out of the courts. They argued that even a court ruling favorable to the government might have a far-reaching implication that it would be to the advantage of the government to work out a negotiated settlement. And I remember a story that my uncle told me about this incident. He said, the government insisted, why should we negotiate with you? And he said, well, maybe it's to your benefit, because if you treat us as a corporation, in the 60s, most colonies were primarily farming, so that meant in winter, they had a huge employment issue. A lot of people were unemployed. He said, then everybody's just going to pull unemployment insurance, and we're going to make more money on this than you do. And so after that, the government said, okay, yeah, let's negotiate. So then that's why the government actually agreed to negotiate with them. So even though the Hutterites agreed to pay, the Hutterites at this time made a significant concession. They accepted an arrangement which carried the appearance of Hutterites receiving an individual income. The Hutterites agreed to take the total income of a colony, divide it by a number of members, make the appropriate deductions, and then report income tax accordingly. Even though the Hutterites agreed to pay income tax in accordance to the terms of the agreement, they did not want to be part of the Canada Pension Plan, which was also something the government was just rolling out. At the beginning of the negotiation, which took place in Winnipeg, a government official assured them that Under the Canada Pension Plan, the Hutterites, in view of their vow of perpetual poverty and the fact that no cash income is received by any one of them, are exempt. Later, the government backtracked on this promise and said they could not exclude the Hutterites from CPP, Canada Pension Plan. However, they also stated that the agreement would not affect the possibilities of the colonies approaching the government in order to obtain a revision to the legislation. The Hutterites agreed to settle the income tax issue first. So they said, we're going to pay the CCP premiums under protest. Let's first settle the income tax issue, then we'll come back to deal with this issue. The government said, sure, you can do that. So in 1968, the Schmiede-Leut and the Larer-Leut communities both signed an income tax agreement with the federal government. So they agreed to the formula. Both of those groups agreed. The Darius-Leut, however, did not agree to sign. The government assumed that the Darius-Leut would eventually fall in line with the other two groups and proceeded to make assessments and to levy taxes. The Darius-Leut, for a number of years, simply fought this issue. They kept taking it to court, they appealed the decisions a number of times. Then eventually a surprising thing happened. They actually won. Like in the final appeal, they actually won. So this turn of events had very serious implications. So the fact that they won the actual ruling, the government ruled they do not have a taxable income. This turn of events had very serious implications for the government and also for the Schmiede-Leut and Larer-Leut, who had been paying taxes ever since 1968. The agreement which they had worked out with the government in 68 was now no longer valid. It raised several important questions. First, would the Schmiede-Leut and Larer-Leut receive a refund for all the years they paid, even though they didn't have to? Second, would all the Hutterite communities now be taxed as a corporation or a trust and end up paying substantially more than what the agreement had obligated them to pay? Third, would it be possible in some way to retain the basic principle of the agreement in some other form, so the principle of the agreement they'd made prior? It didn't take the federal government long to make a decision. The government would assess the Darius-Leut colonies as a corporation. The Schmiede-Leut and Darius-Leut, or Larer-Leut, would keep paying taxes as per their agreement in 69. The Darius-Leut immediately appealed the decision and lost. And the government then turned around and said, here you go, you now owe us $37 million in taxes. This conflict, so a very, very massive amount of taxes if you think about it, especially for that time, it instantly bankrupted all their colonies. This conflict, though it started with the Hutterites working together to try to negotiate a tax agreement with the federal government, soon caused a deep rift to develop between the three groups. The Darius-Leut leaders accused the Schmiede-Leut leaders, the Schmiede-Leut and the Larer-Leut, of paying war taxes, blood money. The Darius-Leut continued to fight the federal government, but ultimately lost their appeals. In the end, they were given the option to either accept the ruling and be taxed as a corporation, or sign on to the same tax agreement as the Schmiede-Leut and Larer-Leut. Grudgingly, they joined the other two Leut, but resentments lingered. The Canada Pension Plan. In 1965, the Canadian government introduced the Canada Pension Plan. And in 1966, the government began to collect the pension premiums. The Canada Pension Plan was considered an important milestone in Canadian social development. It was designed to help people make financial provisions for their retirement and to protect themselves and their dependents. The Hutterites and several small Mennonite groups, mostly located in Ontario, opposed the plan as they felt the program would have an effect of diverting loyalty away from the church. So they said, this is the church's responsibility to take care of our own people, not the government's. Early in 1969, the Hutterites began to express their objection to participating in the Canada Pension Plan. They had not raised any prior objections to the plan, as they were in the process of negotiating the income tax issue. Up until So as part of the income tax agreement, the Hutterites reluctantly agreed to allow the arrangement whereby they would divide their total income by the number of members. Nevertheless, they agreed to the arrangement of income tax that this should be only allowed for the income tax purposes. So they said, we're going to allow ourselves to be, for income tax purposes, to have our total income divided amongst our people, right? So that everybody appears to have a wage, right? And they stress that it can only be used for this purpose. Now the government insisted that the Canada Pension Plan was all-inclusive and that the Hutterites and Mennonites had to pay into the program. The only way the Hutterites could get out of this obligation was if the government agreed to legislative changes against granting them exemption. The Hutterites argued that by forcing them to pay into and accept Canada Pension Plan, the government was violating a promise made to them when they first immigrated to Canada in 1899. The Minister Deputy of the Interior had promised the Hutterites that the Canadian government would not interfere in any way with their living together as a commonwealth, so as a community. The Hutterites said they now understood this, the Canada Pension Plan, to constitute a continuing moral commitment, entitling them to the privilege of exemption from the Canada Pension Plan, which interfered with their communal living in that it made people reliant on the government and not on the community. Even though the Hutterites received support for this case from a variety of different public persons, so there were politicians who supported them, especially politicians who had a lot of Hutterites in their riding, their request for exemption was ultimately denied. The government argued that to exempt Hutterites would create serious problems for young people and others who did not want to continue in these sects. It was pointed out that the leaders of these groups strive continually to maintain their communities against worldly temptations, even to the point of objecting to high school education. Helping the Hutterites in this case would only help them maintain their system and thus slow the process of assimilation. The Canada Pension Plan dragged on for 8 years before a mutual agreement was reached. In actual fact, it actually dragged on much longer. It actually dragged all the way down, I believe, to 91, where they were still negotiating over certain aspects of it. Even though the Hutterite communities, the Hutterites continued to lobby the government, it was actually the Mennonites in Ontario that came up with an agreement or made a breakthrough. This came about largely through the work of a Conservative Member of Parliament, Herb Gray, who, incidentally, was Canada's first Jewish cabinet minister. After meeting with and carefully listening to the Mennonites' request, Mr. Gray agreed to bring the issue to cabinet for further discussion. Mr. Gray was, according to the Mennonite leaders, the first person to give serious consideration to the religious aspect of the problem. Less than 2 weeks later, the government announced that it would bring in an amendment to the Canada Pension Plan to accommodate both the Old Order Mennonites and the Hutterites. After one more round of debate in the House of Commons, the provision granting exemption was passed on the 7th of November, 1974. Like I said, and then it dragged on and on and on and on, all the way down to 1991. There are a couple of important lessons to be learned from this whole process. First is the recognition of the inherent tension that exists between religious groups like the Hutterites and the state within which they exist. The identity and internal dynamics of each group will invariably lead to some form of conflict. As Hutterites, we too often view these conflicts as persecutions by the state. Seeing every stumbling block as a form of religious persecution is, in my estimation, extremely unwise. Indeed, we should recognize that in any healthy multicultural society, there will at times arise tensions between various groups that need to be worked out. A second lesson we can learn is the enormous lobbying effect put forward by the Hutterites. They seemed never to accept the negative answer as final. They did not seek publicity. They did not try to embarrass the government. They were, unshakable in their position and in their belief that the government would eventually see the rightness of their plea. Finally, as Hutterites, we need to be gratefully acknowledge the fact that the Canadian state eventually did extend a degree of accommodation to our forefathers in allowing us to live as communities somewhat separate from the larger Canadian society. The ongoing struggle for education When the Hutterites immigrated to Canada, they came with the understanding that they would be able to have their own schools, where Hutterite educators would work with Hutterite children. However, upon settling in Canada, Hutterites soon discovered that they would have to send their children to public schools. All instruction would be in English, and teachers would be hired by the local school board. It astonishes me to no end that our people simply accepted this situation without putting up a fight. In part, we can blame the social and economic upheavals that the Hutterites experienced during World War I and the subsequent move to Canada. Because of their hasty departure from the US, and the Hutterites suffered significant financial losses. As a result, they had to work extremely hard to earn a living. During the Great Depression, the Hutterite communities, along with the rest of North America, struggled to find enough to eat. As a result, very few new colonies were built. Some even went bankrupt. The Depression years ended when World War II began. This brought on new problems, as the colonies were called upon to support the war effort by having their young men enlist in alternative service camps. In light of these hardships, it is somewhat understandable, but not excusable, that the Hutterites neglected the education of their children. Such was the situation in the Hutterite communities well into the 20th century. The time when Hutterite teachers taught in Hutterite schools was almost all but forgotten. However, an ever-dwindling number of elderly Hutterites never gave up the hope that someday this would again become the reality. It was this older generation who lamented the current situation and kept alive the spark of hope which was needed to once again light the fire which had all but been extinguished. Every great movement needs a catalyst to get it started. So what was a catalyst which finally led to the training of the first Hutterite teachers? One likely reason was the system of permit teachers, which was developed as a way to deal with the wartime shortage of teachers. Under this system, anyone who wanted to try teaching could receive a teaching license. All you had to do was show up, say you wanted to teach, you were granted a one-year license, and there you were. And so many of these teachers were very young people, had no experience working with children, had no experience with teaching. They just tried it. And so as a result, some colonies went through 2 or 3 teachers a year. As one teacher tried it for a couple of weeks, he said, nope, this is not for me, and left. So Jacob Maendel, minister of Fairholme Colony, became increasingly frustrated with this situation. In 1960-61, Reverend Maendel eventually encouraged his brother, Peter Maendel, to take the required training to become a certified teacher. Peter Maendel was soon followed by 5 others. These were Elias Kleinsasser, 1970, David Kleinsasser, 1976 to 1980, Anna and Dora Maendel, and Hilda Maendel from New Rosedale. By 1995, a new wave of Hutterite educators began their formal training under the Brandon University Hutterite Education Program, or BUHEP program. Under the program, Brandon University provided instruction to Hutterite students in a variety of settings and formats. During its years of existence, the BUHEP program saw well over 100 Hutterite educators receive their teaching degrees. However, Hutterite educators today face many challenges. As a supposed bilingual people, we are faced with the reality that we are not truly proficient in either language. English is rapidly becoming our dominant language, but few Hutterites speak it with the fluency of a native English speaker. This is not a surprise, as we live in an English-speaking land and are constantly being exposed to more and more English. In addition, we have greatly neglected the training of our German school teachers. And as a result, German has declined to such a level that many Hutterites are not conversant in their own mother tongue. At the same time, even our dialect we're losing our words in our dialect are being dropped out at an alarming rate. Another major challenge facing all Hutterites is the prevailing attitude that education is not important. Expressions such as "je gelehrter, desto verkehrter" support this misconception that our forefathers thought or taught that higher education was unnecessary and even wrong. However, our Hutterite sermons, chronicles, our confessions of faith, and numerous other writings were not produced by uneducated, uncultured people. Instead, they demonstrate that even though our Hutterite forefathers objected to worldly education, they developed their own system of higher education. As a group, we need to struggle with how a people who were once renowned for the advances in their education system have allowed it to fall into such serious neglect. How have we come to such a place and time when it is even considered wrong by some Hutterites to have our own teachers in our public schools? As we move forward, I hope that the seeds planted by leaders like Jacob and Peter Maendel will continue to grow so that we are able to create an education system which will equip our children to cultivate Hutterite society so it flourishes as it seeks to witness to the kingdom of God. Decade of conflict. Looking back while moving forward. There is nothing more difficult than writing about conflict. This is especially true when you find yourself entrenched in the very conflict you are trying to write about. The 1960s and especially the 70s were a time of tremendous change for the Hutterite communities. As I've attempted to show in the last two lectures, the Hutterite Church, in particular the Schmiedeloi Conference, faced many challenges and changes. The study of history demonstrates that anytime changes are introduced into society, they invariably cause anxiety, concern, and even hostility. The reality of many of these conflicts is that the people who are caught up in them are unaware of the root causes which have brought their particular group or society to this point of crisis. This, I believe, is true for our present context as well. In this final section, I will try to look at some of the key areas of conflict which led to the church schism or break in 92. We will look at some of the key points of tension without going into a great deal of detail. We will conclude by considering whether it is possible to imagine a hopeful future. And so this is probably one of the most difficult things for me to write about because you're dealing with real people. Right? We're not dealing with things that happened in the past. We're dealing with emotions. You're dealing with pain that is present here and now. American versus Canadian struggle for church leadership. During the 1960s, strong tensions within the Hutterite Church began to manifest themselves between some of the American and Canadian communities. Oral histories and personal correspondence between Elder Joseph Kleinsasser from Sunnyside community and key American Schmiedelite leaders show that there was a growing resentment among some American communities towards the church eldership, which was located in Canada since the eldership was revived in 1934. The lack of high-speed transportation and sparse availability of telephone technology meant that the community leaders had to rely mainly on the postal service to communicate. In that era, all major issues or decisions had to be made by a majority vote of all the ministers, or in some cases, all voting members of each colony. For example, when problems arose within the American communities, they were relayed in writing to the elder in Manitoba. If necessary, the elder would then write to all the Schmiedeloi communities, asking them to discuss and vote on the issue. The response was tallied and returned to the elder, who then sent the answer in writing to the American colonies. This created a significant delay in the process, and the American communities felt that their concerns were being delayed in the process. Felt their concerns were being inadequately addressed. The American ministers pushed Elder Peter Hofer, who was elder at that time, to appoint an assistant elder for South Dakota. The church eventually agreed, and in 1962, Elder Peter Hofer had selected Reverend Joseph Hofer from Maxwell, South Dakota, as the first American assistant to the elder. However, by doing so, the church soon found itself in a power struggle. When Reverend Joseph Hofer fell ill and couldn't carry on his duties, a small group of American Schmiedelite ministers appointed a new assistant elder without consulting the new Manitoba elder, Joseph Kleinsasser from Sunnyside. And they installed Reverend Joseph Whip from Plainview, South Dakota, as the American elder. When Elder Joseph Kleinsasser heard about this, he and the Manitoba ministers requested that those responsible come to Manitoba for a hearing. After discussing the issue, the Manitoba leaders and ministers decided to put the incident behind them. But Reverend Joseph Whip from Plainview community had to apologize publicly to the elder and other Manitoba ministers. In a show of good faith, the elder Joseph Kleinsasser then appointed Joseph Whip as the new South Dakota assistant. The increase in tension between the American and Canadian Schmiedelite conferences demonstrates the formation of an ideologic divide which began to manifest itself within not only the Schmiedelite Conference, but the Darius and Laroelite conferences as well. The Darius and Laroelite conferences both have communities located on both sides of the international border, and in both congregations there is a noticeable tension between the American and the Canadian communities. Ideological disunity. During this time, and particularly during the eldership of Joseph Kleinsasser from Sunnyside, further tensions begin to develop between the Hutterite leaders regarding contrasting visions of the Hutterite church. Traditionalist leaders felt that by maintaining the traditions and ordinances of the forefathers, they were honoring their memory and their sacrifice. Do not remove the Marksteine, the milestones, or we need to hold fast to what we have, were their watch cries. Elder Joseph Kleinsasser and other ministers felt that the church had largely failed to live up to the example of the early Hutterites, among other exemplary initiatives, sent out missionaries in accordance with Jesus' teachings. These two conflicting visions came to a head in 1977. In 1977, a year before he passed away, Elder Joseph Kleinsasser refused to call the annual conference of the Schmiedelite. Reverend Joseph Whip from Plainview, South Dakota, demanded to know why the elder dared cancel the yearly conference. The elder replied, "I believe that our Heavenly Father has very little pleasure in such meetings, where very little godly conversation takes place, but mostly temporal or practical matters are discussed or dealt with. In contrast, our Savior's last command to his disciples, Matthew 28:19, is completely disregarded. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living water, and have hewn out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns which hold no water." Jeremiah 2:3. What are these wells which are filled with holes and can hold no water? Joseph Fetter asks. They are human vanity and accomplishments which barely last a year. These things are worthless when it comes to establishing peace and unity. In 1978, the same year he passed away, Elder Joseph Kleinsasser addressed a church gathering in Sunnyside with a lamentation from Jeremiah 11:13. "For your gods have become as many as your towns, O Judah, and as many as the streets of Jerusalem." The elder then asked, "Is this also true among the Hutterite brotherhoods and communities? For one seeks righteousness with a collar on a jacket. If you do not have one or have a different one than I, and then I will not recognize you as a Christian." The other says, "If you have pants with a crooked zipper, or if you do not have the same kind of hat that I have, you are going towards perdition and mocking your salvation." Such imaginations abound as if our salvation were to be found in mere rags. Why don't such think instead about what the Apostle Paul wrote to the Roman church? For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. Those who hold to these things rob Jesus Christ of the honor that he alone deserves and try to honor themselves. What these struggles demonstrate is a growing tension within the Schmiedeloi community church over competing visions of the direction the Hutterite church ought to go. The new elder. When Elder Joseph Kleinsasser passed away in 1978, his serving assistant, Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser from Crystal Spring, was elected the new elder. Over the decades, Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser had become increasingly involved in managing church organizations, particularly the Hutterite Church Corporation, in the fight for equality and justice for the Hutterite people. He was a key figure in the development of the 1950s Constitution, and he negotiated extensively with the provincial and federal governments regarding land restrictions, education, and taxation. As an elder, he had a strong vision for the church and an equally strong personality and leadership style, which often forced underlying issues out into the open. Like Elder Joseph Kleinsasser before him, Jacob Kleinsasser set out to reform the Schmiedeloi Conference, which faced many spiritual and financial problems. Where past annual Schmiedeloi conferences had dealt mainly with establishing and maintaining ordnungen, the new elder began to raise other concerns. For instance, he advocated for improved baptismal instruction to cultivate spiritual development versus the accepted schöne Alter, he's old enough to be baptized, for those requesting baptism. He emphasized prudence, chastity, and temperance within courtship to address loose dating practices and sexual immorality among Hutterite youth. Describing the state of the church at this time, Reverend David Decker wrote, "The greatest evil creeping into the colonies and the sickness of all humanity from the beginning of history was sexual impurity." The elders in 1974 and later our present elder, Jacob Kleinsasser, inherited a sick church community. The elder immediately went to the task of cleaning up the mess, for without cleansing, we were headed for destruction. Illegitimate births were quadrupling, and no end was in sight. Many meetings were called to stop the fire out of control. Many people, including many leaders, did not fully accept the elders' attempts to bring about these spiritual reforms. At the same time, as he was trying to bring about spiritual reforms, Elder Jacob Kleinsasser and other Schmiedeloi ministers were actively looking to find solutions to help financially struggling Schmiedeloi communities. After consulting with church, financial advisors in the greater church, new credit, trust, mutual insurance, and medical companies were formed. To understand why these organizations were necessary, it is helpful to understand the economic context in which they developed. In the 1980s and the 90s, the Schmiedeloi Conference faced significant financial difficulties. Ever since moving to Manitoba in 1918, some of the Schmiedeloi communities had struggled financially because of the huge mortgages and loans incurred from buying land at high prices. But by the 1950s, however, the Hutterites had benefited from the upswing in the world economy, a period of prosperity that lasted until the early 70s. During this time, many of the Hutterite communities began to spend more money than they could afford. According to Reverend Hans Decker from Wolf Creek Colony, this increased focus on earning money had a severely detrimental impact on Hutterite education. Children were pulled from schools as soon as possible so that they could begin to earn money. Brothers who were deemed of little worth in the workforce were appointed German school teachers. This led to a sharp drop in the level of education offered to Hutterite children. According to Hans Decker, unhealthy competition began to develop between wealthier communities and poorer communities as the poor communities tried to match the living standards of the wealthier counterparts. This high standard of living saw the communities building unnecessarily large housing units and purchasing the best vehicles and trucks available on the market. And then in the early 1980s, a recession hit North America, causing Hutterites to experience high inflation and interest rates. The Bank of Canada interest rates hit 21% in August of 1981, and the inflation rate averaged more than 12%. The Hutterite communities most affected by the recession were those who needed to finance the purchase of more land to establish daughter colonies. In 1984, the elder and other ministers met with many bankers, stockbrokers, fund managers, and financial people in an attempt to find answers to these challenges. The new church organizations were developed as part of this process of consultation, which needed a financial commitment from the individual Schmiedeloid communities. For instance, when the Church Credit Corporation was started, it was decided that the wealthier communities would contribute $10,000 annually, and the poorer communities $5,000. At the same time, a $1 million loan was taken from the bank. As the colony's share of the contributions grew, the interest rates owned by the bank would become progressively less. For the most part, these financial maneuvers were successful and in the long term benefited the overall church. However, it must also be acknowledged that they created a lot of tension and disunity. For instance, the fact that there was an economic crisis meant that those Schmiedeloid communities who were struggling financially now had an extra burden of having to contribute funds to the church organizations. Many community financial managers and ministers began to look upon these contributions as an imposed tax and found various ways to avoid paying their community share. The issue of the communities refusing to pay into joint church projects also has a long history. Even though the annual conferences of stewards and ministers agreed that individual communities would lay aside funds to help financially struggling communities, some leaders simply refused to comply. And this dates back to our earliest history here in North America, where it was simply a couple of $100s a year. But some people always just felt we don't want to participate. By the early 90s, the American and some Canadian Schmiedeloid communities began to withdraw from the church organizations, which, without the consent of the rest of the Manitoba communities. Tension within the Schmiedeloid Conference began to build as the Schmiedeloid elder soon found himself facing stronger criticisms. Other major events taking place during this time, which also generated an enormous amount of confusion, anxiety, and dissent, were the Lakeside litigation, the Spring Hill abattoir levy, and the financial crises involving two South Dakota communities. And this eventually led, so it was sort of a building process, right? All these different events were coming together in those years. And this soon led to sort of an open revolt. People just said a lot of people just simply felt they had enough, right? Whenever the Schmiedeloid ministers had a meeting, the elder faced a constant barrage of demands to explain the situation. However, his attempts to explain the complexity of what was taking place failed to silence the opposition. Before he became elder, and during the first decade of his eldership, Reverend Jacob Kleinsasser enjoyed a fairly large popularity. His negotiations with the provincial and federal government on behalf of the Hutterite people was seen by most as very positive and necessary maneuvers. However, when the elder pushed for social and ethical reforms and began to work on establishing financial institutions to help struggling Schmiedeloid communities, his popularity quickly began to slip away. The multiple factors which ultimately led to the church schism of 1992 are far too complex to cover in this lecture. I wish to also acknowledge that there are those who might disagree with some of my assessments. Indeed, I want to acknowledge and learn from these multiple narratives. We have all of us been shaped by the communities and the people that grew up with us, or communities in which we grew up. As such, we all experienced what happened in '92 in many different ways. Today is not a time or place where we can have an in-depth discussion about what happened in 92. What everyone can agree on is that the deep disunity and animosity which developed within the Schmiedeleut conference eventually led to one of the most painful schisms in Hutterite church history. 1992, the church schism. In 1992, the Schmiedeleut schism had at least 3 distinctive phases. So when you look at sort of how it happened, and I'm just trying to go very a high overview. I'm not going into any details here. I'm trying to be very sensitive to the different narratives that exist in this issue. Right? It's simply to sort of begin to sort of understand and wrestle with what has happened. So the initial phase of the schism actually happens quite a few years before you would imagine it did. The initial phase involved growing disunity between the 3 Hutterite-Leut and stemmed from the biannual meetings. These meetings were established to manage the governing bodies of the federally incorporated Hutterite Church. From its inception in the 1950s, the biannual meetings maintained at best a tenuous peace between the 3 groups. In the 50s, the Hutterite Church experienced outward pressure from private individuals and governments who pushed for stricter land and taxation restrictions to curb the expansion of the Hutterite communities. However, by the late 80s, many of these conflicts had been resolved, and as a result, the latent internal issues which had been set aside while the Hutterite communities fended off external attacks begin to re-emerge. 2 of these issues were the conflict over income tax, in which the Darius-Lloyd leadership proposed amendments to the Hutterite Constitution in an attempt to try to evade payment of income tax. A second, even greater issue was the Bruderhof communities. Ever since uniting in 1974, the Darius and Lereloid had become increasingly uncomfortable with the Bruderhof presence in the Hutterite Church. By 1987, they were demanding that the Bruderhof be removed from the Hutterite Church. When it became clear that the Schmiedeleut would not excommunicate the Bruderhof, the Darius and Lereloid drafted a letter in which they stated that they would no longer recognize the Bruderhof members as members of the Hutterian Brethren Church, an act which they formally carried out in 1990. The Schmiedeleut leaders responded by refusing to attend the biennial conference until the Darius and Lereloid retracted their statement about the Bruderhof. This was still the state of the relationship between the groups in 1992. The second phase of the schism was a series of meetings which took place in November of 92, which were convened to address accusations brought against Elder Jacob Kleinsasser. Reverend Joseph Whipp from Plainview, South Dakota, acting as spokesman for the American communities, read out a letter of accusation against the elder. The meeting was concluded by 49 American ministers signing their names in support of the letter. On the 1st of December, the American ministers held a meeting with Lereloid and Darius-Lloyd leaders in Springwater, Montana, where they were given a letter of support signed by both conference leaders. So the Darius-Lloyd and the Lereloid agreed that whatever decision, whatever happens, we will support you. So they gave them sort of their backing, and this happened December 1st. So the final phase took place on the 9th of December in Starlight Community, Manitoba. At this meeting, a letter of 12 allegations against the elder was read. At this point, many ministers from Manitoba Schmiedeleut groups also stood in support of the 12-point letter, drafted by the American communities. The specific details of this meeting and the resulting schism will not be covered in this lecture, as they are far too complex and painful to be treated fairly in the time remaining to us. Let it suffice to say that as a result of the meeting, the Schmiedeleut Conference split into 2 conferences. From 1992 to 2000, the 2 Schmiedeleut conferences engaged in a bitter struggle to determine which group represented the authentic Schmiedeleut Hutterite Conference. Even though December 1, 1992 meeting is considered to be the official date of the schism, in actual fact, the parting of ways happened gradually over the next couple of months and even years. the repercussions of what happened rippled through the Schmiedelite communities. Lines were formed, communities, families, loved ones were torn apart. In our forefathers' time, it was persecution from without the church which brought great hardship and pain upon the Hutterite church. What Canadian author Frank Steele wrote in 1941 seemed to have come true. Someday there may come disintegration from within. Further divisions. In 93, the dissenting group of Schmiedelite, together with the Darius and Lerolite, drafted what became known as the 1993 Constitution and asked all Hutterite communities to affirm. Those Schmiedelites who stayed loyal to Elder Kleinsasser refused to reaffirm and instead chose to stay with the 1950s Constitution. This led to 2 years of legal skirmishes, which only served to entrench both sides in their position. At the same time, both sides were upset at the direction the whole conflict was going. A peaceful settlement seemed impossible while individual communities were still being torn apart, and close to a dozen lawsuits pitting one Schmiedelite group against the other were still before the courts. Even the Dariuslite and the Lerolite were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction they saw the two Schmiedelite groups heading. At a meeting in Rosetown, Saskatchewan, they counseled the Group 2 leadership to do whatever they could to end this church war. And I find it interesting they use that term, end this Kirchenkrieg, right? And in many ways they were honest about it. It was a war. Eventually, renewed efforts to find a peaceful solution brought about a landmark written agreement in which both sides agreed to immediately cancel all legal challenges and work together or towards a peaceful division of the contested Schmiedelite communities. The May 1995 agreement brought about an important but fragile peace. What it demonstrated was that there were parties on all sides who wanted to resolve the conflicts peacefully. But relationships between the individuals brokering the peace deal and the two groups were so severely damaged that the agreement had a tenuous foundation at best. Despite this, the May Agreement did achieve its primary objective. For the most part, the contested Schmiedelite communities were divided on a pro rata basis, thus avoiding costly litigation. However, in some of the contested communities, the animosity and distrust were so deeply rooted that the agreement broke. In 3 of these communities, Oplaf, Prairie Blossom, Cypress, Milltown, Sprucewood Fairway, major disagreements erupted about the value of the assets, which were to be divided. In the end, both groups bitterly accused each other of violating and breaking the agreement. And so the proverbial trenches were dug deeper as both sides refused to compromise their position to reach a consensus. From 1996 to 2000, the 2 Schmiedelite conferences were again on the verge of a costly and lengthy legal battle. Even though the two groups had agreed in principle to recognize each other, a legal battle over who possessed the rights to the name Schmiedelite and Hutterian brethren was about to be fought out in the Canadian courts. Again, both sides realized that they did not want this conflict to escalate, and both sides agreed to meet and try to work out a peaceful solution. Reverend Samuel Wallner from Decker Community summarized what many felt. It is high time to stop putting up walls and time to start building bridges instead. It is time that we start acting like the Christians that we claim to be. On the 10th of April 2000, leaders from both Schmiedelite conferences met in Winnipeg and drafted a letter of understanding which granted both groups the right to the name Hutterian Brethren Church, and that both groups shared a desire to live harmoniously with each other within the Hutterian Brethren Church. The two groups formally adopted the names Group 1 Hutterian Brethren Church, 1950 Constitution, and Group 2 Hutterian Brethren Church, 1993 Constitution. So concluding thoughts. The last 30 years have been years of disintegration, years of wounding, years of deep pain for many of us. Over the years, numerous attempts were made to try and heal the schism and to establish peaceful relations, but most have failed. However, there are also reasons to be hopeful. There are many Hutterites on both sides of this unfortunate divide who are actively and courageously seeking ways towards forgiveness and reconciliation. This work will need to be undertaken with sensitivity so as not to deepen old wounds and inflame grievances, which could only serve to further embitter people on both sides of the conflict. As we begin this journey of healing, we all need to cloak ourselves with the humility of Christ so that we can confess our personal and collective sins of disunity, strife, and pride, which have torn deeply into the fabric of our existence as a people of God. When we look back at the last 100 years, we can see how the Hutterite Church has evolved. Change came about through our interaction with other communal groups, such as the Harmonists in Pennsylvania, the Amana communities in Iowa, and the Bruderhof communities. At the same time, many changes came about simply because of the progress of time, the modernization of our world, the conflicts with our host society. In recent decades, many changes came about because of internal conflicts, as the different Lloyds struggled with competing visions of what it means to be a Hutterite. Ever since arriving in North America, the Hutterites have been divided into 3 conferences, which have each evolved their own identity. After 1918, later for other Lloyd, the Hutterites became further divided into American and Canadian communities. One can observe fundamental differences between the various Lloyd which stem from these national identities. When the Schmiedeloid Conference experienced the painful schism in 1992, 2 different groups of Schmiedeloid came into existence. Significant ideologic differences developed between these 2 groups as they struggled to form their own identity. Intermarriage between the 2 groups never stopped, but was a constant source of tension. The mid-1990s saw the Hutterites part way with the Bruderhof communities. They have developed their own identity. At the same time, because of our shared history and intermarriages, there is still a bond between the 2 groups. In the late 90s, we saw the emergence of independent Hutterite communities such as Fort Pitt in Alberta, Altona in Almendorf, and Grand River in the US. What the implications of these developments will have on the overall Hutterite congregation is still unclear. The initial response within the Hutterite community to all these developments was, and here I'm talking about the developments of communities splitting apart, or especially the 92 split. The initial response within the Hutterite community to all these developments was to launch the Meidung or banning wars. However, the Meidung conflicts proved to be extremely unpopular with the larger Hutterite congregation. Certain leaders pushed for the establishment of boundaries as they saw the issue as a deeply spiritual issue. When we look back at this process, it becomes evident that most Hutterite members never fully accepted the Meidung decision, as many may have felt they had little or no voice in the decision. Part of our present-day reality is that we have created an ethical dualism in which each group sees itself as the pure Hutterite church, and the other, if not decidedly evil, at the very least, second class. This kind of thinking is crippling and wounding and makes it almost impossible to seek reconciliation. Ethical dualism leads to the establishment of walls. It sees the world as black and white, right or wrong. There's no middle ground. As a Christian people, we are called to be kind and tolerant to each other. I want to conclude by reflecting on the legacy of my grandfather, Jacob Maendel, whose vision for community and life, community life, his love for nature, laughter, and story, had the ability to inspire others. Jacob Maendel's spirit of openness inspired a number of non-Hutterites to visit his community of New Rosedale Colony in an effort to explore communal living. John Gaber, John Zuys, Elmer Baer, Norman Randall, as well as the families of Alan and Sylvester Baer, Christian Dorn, and Alexander George. Most of them were immigrants to Canada. Gaber and Zuys from Hungary, Randall from England, the Dorns from Russia, and the Georges from Germany, and the Baers from Ontario, where they previously had also immigrated from Germany. However, Jacob's story is not just his own. Like many of us, he stood on the shoulders of others, whose vision of compassion, of helping others, inspired and shaped his life. One such person was Jacob's father, Jacob Maendel. Born in the U.S., Jacob Fetter served as Haushalter or steward in the Rosedale community, where he became acquainted with the Métis people of Saint Eustache, just across the river from Rosedale. These Métis do not fit in with the larger society, he commented. They are like us in that respect, so it is fitting and right for us to help and support them. The Rosedale Buim, or young men, played hockey on the river with the Métis neighbors, learning each other's language in the process. Joseph Maendel welcomed his Métis neighbors into his home and into his community. One senior men spent countless evenings in the Maendel house, where visitors were treated like members of the family. During the difficult years of the Great Depression, various Saint Eustache folks regularly enjoyed a meal in the Rosedale Community Dining Hall and usually left with extra food to take home. The stories of Joseph and Jacob Maendel challenge us to share our homes, our resources, and our communities with our neighbors who are in need. It is their witness to a spirit of openness and acceptance of others, which may offer us a way forward in our struggle to find peace and unity among ourselves and with others. In the words of Jean Vanier, the late Canadian humanitarian and founder of the Léarch communities, to work for peace and community through acceptance of others as they are and through constant forgiveness is to work for peace in the world and for true political solutions. It is to work for the kingdom of God. Thank you.
About it since this morning, when we started with the 1930s and made it up to approximately the 2000s. It's an astonishing, difficult, challenging task for a historian to cover so many years in such a brief period of time and do it any amount of justice. And I certainly think Ian has done a great job of raising the major issues, key questions, and so forth. So we're going to have some question and answers for a few minutes. I think, according to my clock, we've got about 15 minutes to do that. And we'll take a bit more if we need it and we can tolerate the heat. So as per usual, we've got microphones in front of the aisles. Please come forward, state your name and where you're from, and then we can have some engagement. Keep it short, keep it focused. Ian, you too. Okay? Go ahead.
Thank you. Connor from Canada. Ian, you mentioned the phrase, the forest river is sin. I found it intriguing. I don't know if you could elaborate on that a bit. What do you mean by that?
That was a reference, I guess, to yesterday's speech. So if you want to know the answer, you have to come next year for the next first thing. A briefing up? Sorry. No, it was a reference to 1955 split which happened where a Forest River community split, where half of the community, well, probably a little bit more than half, decided that they wanted to join the Bruderhof community. And so the remaining group, led by Reverend Andreas Hofer, had to come back here to Manitoba, and it spun off its own story, its own history. The story of Airport, New Rosedale, Pine Creek, it's all woven together. So.
Mentioned almost a catalyst for all of the good bishops and involved boys in the army into educating their own children. I find it very interesting was the connection with the Bruderhof in Woodcross. The Gmanen was alle sein Volkswesen were most open to change. Crystal Spring, Riverbend, Elm River, Oak Bluff, Baker. That comprised the first group of Blue Hunters. There's actually other things that we show you. So as the connection with Woodcross and the new ideas, full speed ahead.
I once mentioned that to my uncle, Jacob, sort of if that influence, if the Bruderhof was a significant influence, and he said, oh, no, he said, we had been thinking about that long before they came along. It's just, it took that long, right? So maybe he just didn't want to give credit.
To add something to that, one of the communities that served as the spearheaders of it, Fairholme, had very little interaction with the Bruderhof.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the answer is yang. I think it's a bit of both going on there.
Yeah, I think it was, to come back to that, it was sort of the frustration that a lot of the colonies faced, because during the war period there was a shortage of teachers. So as far as I know, there were colonies where the students attended the local school. They were not on the colony because there was a big shortage of teachers. And so the government tried to get anybody into education they could. I remember one of our profs from, it was one of the Larrys from Brandon, he mentioned that he became a teacher that way. He just needed a ride home with one of his friends. They were working construction, and his friend said, it's too hot here, I'm going to become a teacher. I said, so you come along, and so I had to drive with him because I didn't have a car, and so we went to the legislation and to get the form, and the guy said, here, fill one out too. I said, I don't want to be a teacher. And the guy said, just fill it out anyway. Right? And so he did, and then he gets a call saying, hey, you've been accepted, here's your school. And so that's another story somewhere.
And Sam, if you would hope, maybe you could mention a few words about this education of Gordon Ryan. He was really the one that made it take off.
Mm-hmm.
They were running full speed ahead on the runway, but it was Gordon Ryan's work that made it take off.
Yeah, I think that's true in many cases. It's often, in many of the situations in the church, it's either pressures from outside our community or people, non-Hutterites, who step in to help us do these things. And I think it's time that we do that we start taking leadership. Because we invariably then end up going directions that we didn't foresee because it wasn't maybe our idea initially, right? But you're talking about Dr. Gordon Neufeld, I'm thinking, Neufeld, not that guy, Dr. Gordon Reimer, who was instrumental in getting the BUHEP program started. He was a professor, I believe, at Brandon, who approached our education committee and said, here's a great opportunity. We have a similar program for training native teachers. With just a little bit of tweaking, we can make this work for the Hutterite communities. Are you interested? And yeah, it happened. A couple of people were. So here we are today.
First of all, thank you very much for a very good lecture this morning and this afternoon. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I'm Peter Peters from Winnipeg. I was one of those permanent teachers in 1953 in New Rosedale Colony, and I enjoyed the company of Peter Maendel, John Maendel, and Alton Baird and others. I learned much, I mean much, from a theological point of view, what it means to be brotherhood. I also learned much about education psychology, and so on, when I went to university later on and so on. When I think about it now, I wonder, that I had 36 students, and I didn't teach anything worthwhile at that time. I was just an 18-year-old fellow, high school graduate,
With 30 kids.
as naive as you could possibly imagine, and you put up with me. I will just say, my father-in-law was the manager of the Christian Press in Winnipeg, and he sent a number of Mennonite teachers out here, including two of his sons, Frank Clausen, Rudy Clausen. There was Arnie Peters and not a relative of mine and others that came, all because Hutterites came to him and asked, are there some good Mennonite teachers that could become available? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So what year was that when you were teaching in Rosedale? You know? What year was it that you were teaching in Rosedale?
1953.
Go ahead.
Ian, I don't know if this is a question that you can answer, but I'd like to ask in many ways. With the historians, let's say bird's eye view, have you spent any time thinking, if you take a look at the 90s split as sort of the watershed between before and after, and if you look back, what are some of the lessons that you can or did have taken away that you would perhaps advise future leaders to consider in, I guess, the programs, the institutions, the methods, the approaches that Jacob Fetter took? Are there any reflections that you have, any thoughts to share about, maybe let's say for a future leader?
Yeah, that is something I've wrestled with quite a bit. And I think I tried to touch on it in that lecture in the reference to the Bruderhof reuniting. I think there were some classical mistakes made there. And one of them was to ignore differences. Right? I believe that they consciously chose not to focus on their differences, right? Because they felt, well, it would create dissension, it would maybe stop the uniting. But in doing that, they right away planted the seeds of disunity, right? Because you silence a significant portion of your leadership. And if you look at sort of what happened in the church prior to that, during Peter Fetter from Gemseli was what I would refer to probably as a more conservative type leader. And then later, Joseph Fetter, I don't know him personally, but just based on some of the things he's written, especially Jacob Kleinshauser, these were more progressive, right? And so you have this shift happening exactly at that time where the leaderships, I think, became more progressive, and there was still a very significant element within the church, a very big group, that were traditional and had very strong traditional values or concerns. But there were also others who felt sincerely that these concerns were hindering the growth of the church. And so those two competing visions I speak about, right, were there, and we have to acknowledge that they're there. Right? You can't pretend they're not there or silence one group because it only, it causes problems further down the road.
Thank you. You can't, okay. Is it okay if I ask a question while you make your way here? Okay. Ian, particularly in the last lecture, but you can also use the other first two as a jumping point. What is the most interesting thought or idea that occurred to you in your process of researching and writing this? These are not new topics for you, okay? But you sat down in the last 3 months or so and wrestled with this 100-year period. What is something that caused you to sit back and say, oh, could you reflect on that?
I think it's probably the thought, we are like the world, only later in time. Right? We think because we are isolated, because we live in separated communities, that the world is outside our communities. And I don't think we've wrestled really with what that means, what it means to be worldly, in a sense, right? That often, in many cases, I remember one minister I was at a funeral, and the minister was talking on that, and he said, if you think the world is out there, you're wrong. It's right here in your own head, right? And I was thinking, wow, okay, that's so true, right? Just because we live separate doesn't mean that we're not being influenced by or acculturated to the Canadian and the American context. And we need to start, I think, wrestling with that. What does that mean? If you look back to our forefathers, in their time, they often said no to things that were happening in society around them that they perceived as being wrong. And I think we need to start asking those questions. For instance, capitalism, technology. I mean, technology, we all know, is a huge challenge for us. It's here. We can't legislate it away. I think, like Marcus Bach said, there's no way we can make a boundary and say, you will not pass. Because ideas cross all boundaries. And so we have to realize these ideas, these influences are coming into the church, and we need to engage them.
So, to summarize, it'd be safe to say that we are foolish to think that we are not influenced
Yes.
by our context,
Yeah.
by the place and the time in which we live.
Yeah, and I think it became extremely clear throughout the research how we've been influenced, how our legal structure is mirrored and reflects sort of the tensions and the sort of tensions from without our communities, right? I mean, there's a whole lecture on just simply how our legal structures, how we went from corporation to unincorporated to trusts to operating like just that whole legal frame, which I think most Hutterites are not aware that even exists. And yet, whenever problems arise and somebody wants to leave a community, or suddenly the legal structure kicks into place almost all by itself, right? And I think it's a significant part, the awareness of it. I've often thought about the difference between the Interlake and the Lakeside court cases and how people within the Hutterite community reacted to those two incidents. Very, very different, right? In one, everybody supported it. The other, there was massive dissent. And the question, why? What changed?
Go ahead.
A walking legend.
First of all, I'd like to thank Ian's presentation. A lot of the questions I was wondering about, I think you answered it.
Paul Bear.
Paul Bear of New Rosedale College. One of the bears that joined up years ago. And, thanks again, Ian. I also want to thank Peter Peters, behind me somewhere. He was one of my teachers in New Rosedale in 1953. I must have been a bad guy because he never looked at me today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul Fetter.
Thank you, Paul, for that. Any further questions? This would also be a time when you can make some observations. Like Ian painted with incredibly broad brush strokes. But if there's, something that you think Ian should know or consider in his future work, I usually, this doesn't fit in with Q&As, but I welcome that now. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Ian. I'm Johnny Ginsberg. I was fascinated by all the people who said that your grandpa, just because he had an open mind, how many people he influenced to join or come and live community. We have too much attitude. Anyway, I can talk from our place. If somebody comes and visits, we can plant a seed, but the attitude is mostly, if he didn't stay, it was a total failure. That's it. Well, we can plant a seed and it can go somewhere else. It just has to germinate here. My grandpa was like that too. My grandpa would give his own bed for somebody, just to give him a chance to live community. And I saw my grandpa in so much of this. Our forefathers, they had a zeal for mission. And I challenge everybody in this room, where did our zeal go? A lot of times we don't even want the people to stay overnight. That's how far We've come from their zeal to ours. Let's regroup, and we have their vision, let's follow it.
Yeah, I think you make a very excellent point. And the question of where that zeal went, I think if we look at the financial struggles that the colonies went through, especially in the early years, they were very formative in a sense. And I think they reshaped the vision because the focus in those early years was on just survival, like financing. And so the shift went into earning money. And I think we're now well enough established, we should be able to say, okay, we need to start looking at other things. And I think we are. I think there are many communities that are doing that. Like there's tremendous amount of good I think that a lot of colonies are doing, not only in their communities, in the communities around their communities, or even in other on other continents. So thank you, Johnny.
I know we had, through the years, we had lots of Koreans come and say, every single one of them said, our life has changed. Even if we're only giving money, our life has changed. We've never been the same.
Thank you for that thought.
Hutterian, formerly Forester Colony, which I always include as part of my identity. I basically wanted to say, I know I'm not supposed to give a speech, but to commend you for the way you handled the division, the ongoing division, unfortunately, in the Hutterite Church. And I hope that the ministers from both sides will be very happy to hear when that is circulated among them as to how well it was handled. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Terry.
I wanted to mention that today you mentioned several people that came to the Hutterite Society from different backgrounds, and which included myself. And but there was, I told you this already, but there was no mention of a lady who must be.
We don't celebrate women.
No, you don't. A lot of people are not aware because many years have passed, but a woman who had been a school teacher in the colonies in South Dakota, I think it was a Rosedale colony, and she was an English teacher in a Hutterite colony. And she was so enlightened by what she experienced with the brothers and sisters there, that she felt the call of God to give her life in service in community. And her name was Barbara, and her last name was Gross. And Barbara eventually joined the colony at Huron, here in Manitoba, and lived there for many, many, many years. And she came from my home place of Freeman, and I was somewhat inspired by the step that she took, to be honest with you. That's why I like her name remembered today, and always. Barbara Gross, and she became a part of the Huron colony, a member here in Manitoba. Eventually married to John Cease, and they spent a number of years there, and then eventually he moved on to the in Ontario. But I just want to remember the name of Barbara Gross, a woman from the outside who came to give her life in service to God and the community. Thank you.
Margaret Wallner, one of the things, like I think you all three experts, and one of the things that question that I guess that keeps coming up is what does it mean to be a Hutterite, especially now? What if together we all focus on that and just branching out what Johnny from Gemsdale said is maybe we could focus on that, bringing the groups together. What does it actually mean to be a Hutterite? I just felt that that's what I'm going to be taking home with me, and I hope that others will as well. So, thank you very much.
So you want me to answer what it means? I have an answer. Oh, no, I don't.
Any was probably cut you off.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap this up. It's been a wonderful series, 3 lectures that Ian poured hours and hours into. I'd like to call Jesse forward to kind of present Jesse with, or Ian with a small token of our appreciation.
Before I do so, I also want to recognize Kenny's role in making these lectures possible. It was 9 months ago that we met in the room, the ad hoc Centennial Committee that Kenny called together, where the dreaming for this lecture started, and today it's become a reality. So Kenny, thank you for taking initiative on that. So how do we thank Ian? That's a big job. And Ian, you've really given us a gift here. You've been very sensitive, you've been humorous at times, but also challenging. And all of us are going to leave with something for you. But as a small token of our appreciation, Ian, we have this Joseph Beck Geschichtsbücher and a little bit of something on the inside. So,
All right. Thank you very much.
thanks so much, Ian, for doing this.
My cup is so threadbare already. Thank you very much. And thank you again, everybody, for coming. I really, really appreciate every one of you who've come and listened to this story. And let's do it again.
Yes, indeed we shall. Please stay tuned for future events like this. Hopefully, at the very least, it will become annual. Thank you for coming. We're very grateful to Trinity United for hosting us. This has been a wonderful venue. Maybe next time we'll do it in winter so we have, a cooler environment in here. But that's the challenge of working with a heritage building, okay? And this is something we can put up with. So thank you for coming. Go in peace. God bless.